Chapter 2, Police History, Part 2. Robert Peel is often credited with writing certain principles of policing. They're often known as the 9 principles of policing. However, researchers have since discovered that Robert Peel didn't write this particular list. Instead, what police historians have found is that these 9 principles of policing, often called the Peelian principles, but again, they're really not, they weren't really written by Robert Peel, although he certainly endorsed them. But historians have found that these principles were really representative of the thinking of the early police creators back in the 1800s. So the innovators, the ones who created the first police departments, this reflected much of their thinking. And so we have these 9 principles of policing that still exist today and that still are often cited by police chiefs and other police experts. And so even if they weren't written by Robert Peel, they definitely do reflect the thinking of that time, of the early days of policing in the 1800s. And they're worth studying even today because they still have great relevance today, maybe even more relevance today than they did back in the 1800s. So let's take a look at them. Now, I don't expect you to memorize each of these, but we're going to identify some themes that are recurrent throughout these 9 principles of policing. So the first principle is the notion that the police exist to prevent crime and disorder. Okay, so the key word here, I think, is prevent. And so the principles of policing were emphasizing a proactive form of policing, that when they created these first police departments, the idea was that the police should be more geared towards preventing crime than necessarily responding to it. Certainly responding to crime is going to be a part of the prevention as well. If criminals are getting away with it, they're going to continue to commit crimes, and so you want to catch the criminals. But even more important for the early creators of police departments, they wanted the police to prevent crime, stop it before it even happens. And over the course of our next few lectures, we're going to discuss how this mission, this purpose really gets forgotten, and modern policing even today is much more reactive than proactive. Police officers, especially on patrol, are often kind of in a holding pattern and just waiting for that next radio call to come in, rather than being proactive and trying to discover the roots of crime and trying to deal with those roots and in such a way that they're able to prevent crime before it happens rather than just respond to it after it happens. The second principle is the first one that we see of many that are going to discuss the relationship between the police and the community. And so here the emphasis is on the police gaining some kind of public approval for their action. So that implicit in this particular principle is that the police must constantly be looking to the public to see if they are serving the public. Now remember from our last lecture in this chapter, our first one in this chapter, we mentioned that when the first modern police department was created, there was a lot of resistance to it because people were afraid that police were going to take away the rights of individuals. Well, this particular principle is a response to that by saying, no, the police serve the public, not the other way around. It's not that the public serves the police, as we discussed in chapter 1 with autocracies, that the public is expected to serve the government. Well, in a democracy, in a free society, the police are to serve the public. And so we see here that this principle is basically pointing us in that direction, saying that if the police are going to be effective in carrying out their duties, they must have public approval. If they are in constant strife with the public, they're probably not going to do a very good job. Continuing on with this theme of police-public relationship and accountability of the police to the public, we have here in the third principle that if the police want the public to voluntarily observe the law, so that the police don't have to force the law upon them, but the public is viewing the law as good, the police as good, then in order to obtain the willing cooperation of the public in doing this, in voluntarily obeying the law, then the police must work to obtain the respect of the public. So again, here's another principle saying police constantly be serving the public and checking with the public and trying to obtain the public's respect. So that has to be earned. That's not given. That has to be earned. And so again, are the police in your community, if you think about your police, have they earned your respect? If they don't have your respect, then likely principle number 2, the voluntary observance of the law, principle number 2 with the voluntary, the approval of the police through the public and the ability of the police to perform their duties is probably going to be diminished if the police aren't respected. So these all tie together. Once again, another principle that deals with that community-police relationship. How much cooperation will the police obtain? Well, this principle says the amount of cooperation is going to decrease as the police feel they have greater necessity to use force. To put it more plainly, the more the police have to rely on force to get the public to comply with the law, obviously the less likely there is going to be cooperation from the public with the police. And so if we want the public to help us, if we're the police and we want them to help us to perform our duties, to secure safety in the community, then we need to find ways to get that cooperation apart from forcing it upon the public. We want the public to voluntarily cooperate with us, so that goes back to principles number 2 and number 3, that we must have public approval and public respect. So you can see how these fit together. Finally, at least on this page, we still have 4 more principles after this. We see that the police, according to the principles of policing, that the way that the police, if they want to get the public's respect, then the way that they need to achieve that is through impartial enforcement of the law. So let's not be biased in our policing efforts. If we update it to modern times, let's not engage in racial profiling. Let's not engage in other kinds of profiling. Let's not give breaks to people because of their class, because there may be higher class versus lower class, because these are our friends, because of any other number of reasons. If the police want to get the public's favor and respect, then they don't merely just cater to public opinion. So they just don't do everything that the public says. Now that may have seemed to be what we were moving towards when we said in principle number 2 that the police need public approval, but gaining public approval doesn't mean that we do everything the public wants us to do. Instead, we enforce the law impartially, without discrimination, without prejudice. You know, there are going to be times when the public wants the police to take the gloves off and be tough on criminals. And legally they may not be allowed to do that. And so the police need to, in that instance, not do what the public wants them to do. The police need to constantly keep their eyes on what's professional, what's legal, what is ethical. And when there are times that the public wants them to do something different, they need to go against public opinion. And that may seem to be contradicting principle number 2 that we discussed, that said the police need public approval, but we have to look at the long term, not the short term. For the short term, there may be times when the public disagrees with the police, but if the police are doing the ethical, responsible, professional thing, then in the long term, they will achieve the public's approval. Principle number 6 really tells the police that they're not out in the streets to use physical force and to coerce people into obeying the law. That they've been hired to be police officers because of their brains, not because of their brawn. And so when we read this particular principle, that police use physical force to the extent necessary to secure observance of the law or to restore order, only when the exercise of persuasion and advice and warning is found to be insufficient. So the use of physical force, at least as imagined by the early creators of police departments, should be the last resort. We should only turn to physical force when all other means of persuasion and advice and warning have been exhausted. So if we can't persuade this person, if we can't advise them, if we can't warn them, if we can't use our communication powers to bring the situation under control, then physical force is warranted. But physical force shouldn't be our first response to every situation. And sometimes that in American policing history has been forgotten. That police are too quick to resort to physical force. And many times police officers in the past, hopefully not as much today, have been hired because they're 6'4" and 250 pounds and they can knock some heads together. Well, we don't want that type of police officer. We want a police officer who's able to think first, talk effectively, deal with the situation with the least amount of force possible. Again, this principle isn't saying that we should never use force. Sometimes force is necessary, but that it should be very greatly restricted. Principle number 7 suggests that the police should never forget that they're part of the community. So this is a rather long principle, but it basically says, if we condense it down to a few phrases, the police are the public and the public are the police. So both the police and the public have responsibilities for preventing crime and disorder. The only difference is that the police are the paid professionals who are devoted to this as their full-time job. But the public also has a mission, which we sometimes forget. We'd like to place all the responsibility on the shoulders of the police, but the public has a job too. And the police should never forget that they are part of the community. So there shouldn't be this separation of us versus them. Unfortunately, we see that in a lot of communities. Number 8, police should always direct their actions strictly towards their functions and never appear to usurp the powers of the judiciary. What this essentially means is, police, remember who you are. You are not the judge, jury, and executioner. So you should not decide, well, the courts aren't doing their job, they're just slapping criminals on the wrist and not giving them real punishment, so therefore I'm going to take care of it myself. No, that's not your job. Your job ends at some point. Your job is mostly directed at patrolling the streets, investigating crime, gathering evidence. Your job is not to be the judge in the particular case, the jury in the case. Your job is not to try this person on the streets. That's where the courts will do their jobs. So limited powers of the police. And finally, the last principle. This one is often tricky for a lot of students. The test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with it. So we should measure how well the police are doing by the absence of crime and disorder. We shouldn't measure their efficiency by what it appears that they're doing. So if they're just doing things for the sake of doing them, because we don't know what else better to do, if we're just doing things to look good, that's not the real test of police efficiency. So if the police do something that appears to be an action that's responsive, but it's really not doing anything to really stop or deter crime, then the police shouldn't be doing it. So later in the course we're going to talk about the efficiency of patrol and effectiveness of patrol. General patrol is really not a good crime deterrent. It really doesn't do a lot to diminish crime. And so therefore we might question, why do we do so much of it? Do we just do it because it looks good to the public and that's what the public expects? Well, this principle would say if that's the only reason we're doing it, we need to move our resources to a different strategy and not rely so much on patrol. So summarizing, what are the major themes of the 9 principles of policing? First, the emphasis is on prevention of crime and disorder, so a proactive form of policing. Let's get ahead of the crime problem. Secondly, that in the principles, there are lots of principles devoted to the notion of public accountability and a partnership with the community. So the police should be accountable to the public, they should serve the public, but they should also have a partnership with the public. Use of force is de-emphasized. It should be a last resort, not a first resort. And there are limited powers. The police should realize that their mission is limited. They are not supposed to be the entire criminal justice system, and they should respect the boundaries of their powers. They shouldn't try to overstep them and do more than what they are supposed to do.